The questions that you asked the agent is going to affect the quality of the thing that you get out. That's Michael Bolin, tech lead for the open source Codex repo, talking about what actually separates useful AI coding from expensive confusion. Welcome to Xpulse Digest. Bolin told this story on the Peterman pod, and it's packed with the kind of career and craft lessons that only show up after you've shipped dev tools to tens of thousands of engineers, and then watched a coding agent write most of your code. Long before agent meant a model driving your terminal, Bolin's master's project was basically a weird, early prototype of the idea. It was a Firefox extension called Chickenfoot, a sidebar tool aimed at end-user programming for the web. You'd write little commands like enter first name and click search. And under the hood, it used heuristics to guess what you meant. It would look at words near inputs, accessibility tags, alt text, then drive the page through JavaScript. What makes it feel strangely current is the shape of the problem. You're trying to translate a human intention into a sequence of reliable UI actions, despite a messy environment. Back then, it wasn't natural language. It was more like a tiny DSL. Now, the same idea shows up as a model that can read your repo and operate tools. And yes, it worked best on Craigslist, because simple websites are the great equalizer. People even automated real tasks with it and made money, which is the most honest product-market fit signal there is. The funny part is how much work they did to fake understanding. Today, we outsource that to models, and the question becomes what you're willing to trust them with. Bolin got drawn to Google for the early web reasons. He remembered the shift from cluttered portals to the clean, principled, this search is just better vibe, and he wanted to work with those people. Inside the company, he noticed something that hits a lot of engineers sooner or later. Some things have internal prestige, and some things don't. Search and infrastructure were core. Consumer products like Calendar and even Gmail had impact, but not always the same cachet. Then came the painful lesson. He worked extremely hard on things he cared about, including Google Tasks and the Clojure JavaScript toolchain, even writing a book because he was motivated. But career recognition didn't automatically follow high-quality work. The mismatch was simple. The work mattered to him more than it mattered to the company. That's the kind of disappointment that feels personal, until you realize it's often just incentives. And once you see that, the next move becomes obvious. Find a place where the stuff you're excited about is also what the organization is desperate to win at. He eventually landed at Facebook right when mobile was becoming existential, and hit a wall that made him consider switching projects just to stay sane. At Meta, the Android build experience was brutal. If you'd lived in web dev land, edit, refresh, done is the baseline. Here, iteration time was so painful it blocked everything. So Bolin did the most dangerous thing you can do as a new hire with limited credibility. He decided to build a new build system in a hackathon. Almost everyone told him it was a bad idea, except one senior Android engineer, John Perillo, who basically said, "Do it fast before anyone cancels it, and I'll back you if you ship." That small slice of support mattered, because speed is persuasive in a way arguments aren't. The key technical intuition wasn't mystical. He looked at what the existing tool was doing and noticed it effectively started over from scratch whenever anything changed. For incremental builds, that's a disaster. The win came from understanding dependencies well enough to cache results from steps that didn't need to rerun. Then he attacked a second-order problem. The codebase barely had modules, because adding one meant dumping a couple hundred lines of XML into an Ant build script nobody wanted to touch. Buck made modularization simpler, which made builds more incremental, which made everything feel faster. There's a subtle influence lesson baked into how he sold it. He didn't pitch it as, "I'm going to change the whole company." He framed it as, "I'm trying to make an Android build system, minimized friction, and let the performance speak." A year later, iOS engineers asked to use it too. At that point, the science project had become infrastructure. Once you're the person who makes dev cycles faster, you start seeing scaling limits everywhere. Meta's mobile apps were huge, and they kept hitting tool limits before everyone else. IntelliJ was workable for Android. Xcode, for their scale, wasn't. When they asked Apple for help, the feedback was essentially, "Your project is too big, make it smaller." So building an editor started to feel justified, not indulgent. Bolin's reasoning was concrete. If you want an Xcode replacement, developers need tight integration with simulators and physical devices. You could route that through the web, but it's extra work and extra fragility. There was already a web-based IDE effort, built on an abandoned Google Web Toolkit project. And that's where his taste got sharp. Meta was the React company. Building core dev tools on a dead stack felt like choosing pain on purpose. He did the same low-friction move as with Buck. He scoped it narrowly, focusing on iOS, not trying to take over. Leadership eventually backed his approach, partly because the technical argument landed, and partly because Buck had already built credibility. That arc also highlights a weird truth about senior engineering. Shipping one big win changes what people will let you attempt next, even if the next bet is even riskier. But the higher you climb, the more it stops being just about what you can build. It's also about how you push an organization without bulldozing it. After getting promoted to E8, Bolin tried to jump into web speed at Facebook. The load time of Facebook.com was in bad shape. The architecture was stale. The problem was huge. And this is where he describes the hero quest. It's that ego-tinged fantasy where there's a big Gordian knot, everyone wishes someone would solve it, and you think, "I'm the person who can walk in and untie it." He tried wild experiments, like compiling V8 from source and seeing if changing how they generated JavaScript could help. None of it panned out. The honest diagnosis was painful and useful. Some projects are about writing a lot of code from the beginning. Some are about data, persuasion, and deep domain context. This one needed the second type, and that wasn't his strength. The lesson wasn't, "Don't stretch." It was more precise. There's a smaller subset of work you genuinely enjoy, and you're far more likely to create outsized impact if you stay near that zone while expanding it gradually. That connects to his 3-step career rule from his writing. First, figure out what you really like doing. Second, figure out what your employer truly values. Third, find the intersection and lean in. The sting is that sometimes the intersection just isn't there, and that's when changing teams or changing companies becomes the rational move, not the dramatic one. And when he found the right project again, it wasn't a flashy feature. It was the kind of thing that makes everyone else faster without noticing why. Meta's monorepo kept growing, and the future problem was obvious. Traditional workflows assume you can clone and materialize everything locally. At some size, that becomes misery. The virtual file system project was about lazy loading the repo. You can be on a commit, and if the OS asks for a file's contents, the system fetches it so it looks like everything is laid out on disk, even though it isn't. But the real danger is downstream tools. If your editor or search tool immediately walks the whole file system, you've just destroyed the point of virtualization. So Bolin worked on making tools behave like the file system is virtual. One example was file search. Many editors speed this up by scanning all files up front. That's exactly what you can't do. They built an internal service called Miles, indexing file names from new commits over time, tracking adds and removes, and supporting fuzzy matching. You could send a query with the commit you're on, plus any local changes, and get results fast. The numbers are the kind that make you sit up. Over 1 million files in something like 10 to 20 milliseconds, fast enough that you're typing in an editor and it just feels instant. Under the hood, part of the trick was a 64-bit mask per file for which characters appear, so you can exclude huge swaths quickly. And the data structures were laid out in parallel arrays for CPU cache friendliness and easy parallelism. Not a textbook try. More like, I want the CPU to eat this in one bite. It started as a support piece for the file system, but it became useful broadly. He mentioned dozens of servers running Miles globally by the time he left. If you're looking for what E8 impact while still writing code can look like, that's it. Build a force multiplier that changes how fast everybody else can move. Then he moved to a place where the force multiplier isn't just internal developer speed, it's how millions of people write code. Bolin went to OpenAI after spending 2023 at Meta building LLM-based developer tools. He wanted to build with the best models, and he wanted to build product alongside the people building the model. That shift came with culture shock. OpenAI is research-led, and he's blunt that it's an adjustment. The harness work matters, but if the model isn't good, it doesn't really matter how clean your system is. On Codex, the launch story is messier than the usual "and then it hockey sticked" myth. Codex CLI shipped in April 2025, demoed at the end of a live stream, open-sourced, and got a burst of adoption, with something like 10 to 20,000 GitHub stars in a week or two. But it was rushed, and the team wasn't staffed to drive it the way it needed. A month later, they launched a more ambitious web product, where Codex runs in a container, and you can even kick off work from your phone. It was well-staffed, and he still thinks the long-term vision is right, but users weren't quite ready. Local agents were stickier. Over the summer, they shifted resources back toward the CLI, added a better terminal UI, supported the open model in the TUI, and shipped a VS Code extension. GPT-5 coming out around that time helped too, in his telling. The confluence is what triggered the inflection. Then there's his personal workflow, which is where it stops being abstract. He says models write about 80 to 90% of his code now, debugging tests, fixing CI, doing refactors, splitting a too big PR into reviewable commits. That stuff is a sweet spot. The 10% he keeps closer is the scary part. The Codex harness is in Rust. He works on OS-specific pieces and sandboxing, the security boundary that keeps the model inside the constraints you set. That's where he wants strong test coverage and direct control. He also described a kind of throughput game. He keeps 4 or 5 clones of the Codex repo on his machine, uses the Codex app to multitask, and tries to juggle more work in flight than a human could normally hold. It can feel hectic, but you're getting more done. At one point, he admits he almost feels bad writing code by hand, because if he'd asked the agent the right way, he wouldn't have had to. And that loops back to the sharpest point in the whole conversation. Capability is rising fast, but the bottleneck today is still you, and the questions you know how to ask. What lands hardest is how consistent his story is across decades of tooling shifts. From Chickenfoot guessing which text box you meant, to Buck caching what didn't change, to a virtual file system that refuses to materialize the world, to a coding agent that writes 90% of what you ship. the advantage keeps coming from the same place. It's taste. Knowing what matters, what's safe to automate, what's worth rebuilding from scratch, and what question unlocks the next step. Bolin's not pretending the answer is obvious for beginners. He flat out says he doesn't have a perfect solution for how a new engineer builds that intuition in an agent-heavy world. But he keeps coming back to one thing. Go deeper through the layers of abstraction, learn how the machine actually works, and you'll ask better questions. If you want the full context, including the messy launches and the career mistakes that made the later wins possible, listen to Michael Bolin on the Peterman Pod. Because the future might belong to agents, but the present still belongs to the person who knows what to ask them.